Hello and welcome to What Would Jane Do? Today we are feeling very regal because we are going to tackle the topic of what would Jane do about King Charles III and I suppose by extension Queen Camilla. And today, as usual, I'm joined by my wonderful podcaster in crime, Kate McFarlane. Though actually today, Kate, I must say you look very far from being in danger of sent to Botany Bay, because for those of you who are seeing this with a visual, you can see that she is splendidly dressed, ready to go to the coronation ball, complete with tiara. So as I was saying to her before we started recording, I am incredibly underdressed because I'm intending to do some gardening, but you did need gardeners to prepare for coronation. So that's my role is like the servant class. And Kate is, yeah, it's a rerun of the Two Ronnie sketch.
Well, I always say, when in doubt, wear a tiara.
Yes.
And that
Yes,
goes for men as well as women, obviously.
absolutely. You can't go wrong with a tiara. Um, okay, so what would Jane do about Charles III? Well, the first thing to say when I was thinking about this topic is actually there was no British coronation during her lifetime.
No.
That was due to the long life of George III and then the regency. So she
Mm.
died before the regent became George IV. But there were, of course, plenty of coronations available. Other coronations are available. If you wanted to look, say, for example, to Russia, I think it's Tsar Alexander who takes over when his father is assassinated in the 1800s.
Yes, quite
And
possibly.
obviously, you've got Napoleon
Yes.
crowning
He
himself.
was an
Well,
emperor.
yeah, he keeps upping the ante, plus all his relatives were getting crowned, which I would have thought rather, from a British point of view, rather, I don't know, devalued a coronation if the little upstarts, like from their point of view, I hasten to add to French viewers, if they were doing it. But I don't think that Jane opined on that subject. Anyway, but so there was plenty of familiarity with the whole idea of a coronation at the
Hmm.
time. Now, so this leads us into what was happening in the royal family during Jane's lifetime. So first thing to say, it is much worse, much worse than any of the minor little flurries happening in the current royal family. Take it away, Kate. Tell us some of the things that you've noticed were going in the royal family at the time.
Well, I can't ever claim to be an expert on the royal family
No,
now and,
no,
and
but you know a
before.
few things.
But I know a few things. Well, as usual with any aristocracy of any time, really, with power comes, one would argue, great responsibility. But what inevitably happens is great profligarity, is it? Because if you have unlimited power, enormous wealth, connected friends, you can get away pretty much with just about anything. And they certainly gave it their best in terms of numerous lovers, numerous Fitzwilliams, I dare say, born on the wrong side of the blanket. The Prince Regent himself was notorious for having affairs with very unsuitable women, not of his class necessarily. Was it Mrs. Fitzherbert?
Yes, that
Um,
was actually what they call a is it more organic marriage?
yes, yes,
Basically,
he did actually want to marry her.
he
Yes,
got
yes,
married
he got married. Yes,
without the permission of the king, which made it
yes,
invalid.
yes. So it was a bit disastrous, which is a bit of a shame because then, as now, often I'm sure most royalty is not encouraged to marry who they want. There's all sorts of other dynastic implications to be considered first. Not least, of course, is that certainly the British royal family is so tied in with the church. So even most recently, Queen Elizabeth was telling her sister she couldn't marry the man she wanted to because he was divorced. Obviously, things have got a little bit better since then, but that's still within living memory for some people. So I think it's interesting how the royal family and the royal family of Jane Austen's day, um, you're constantly living in this precarious world of having to act or having to be seen to act as the perfect family and the family that the nation follows, you've also got a tenuous hold of power. That's not to say they wouldn't live perfectly well if somebody said that they didn't want the monarchy anymore, because they've got a lot of wealth and a lot of connections. But if you want to remain royal, you have to be seen as better than everyone else, and yet your very station in life gives you so many temptations to behave worse than everyone else. And I think
Yeah.
that's a conundrum that's beset monarchies for as long as they've been around.
And I think because of the lampooning culture of the time,
Oh
there
yeah,
was no pretense that this was a perfect family,
no,
where you do get that with the sort of memorabilia,
mm,
touristy aspect, and obviously the last great queen's wonderful years of service, where you
mm,
kind of felt actually she was a jolly good thing for what she was doing. So let's just go through it from the top
mm.
down to show how much problems there were. So you've got at the top of this, you've got George the Third,
Yes.
who came into power in 1750-ish. I should have looked at the
Sounds about
timeline.
right. I know I'm
Um,
terrible on dates.
and he was Farmer George. He
Hmm.
was happily married and faithfully married, as far as one can
Yes, and
tell
had
these,
many, many, many children.
yes, to his queen.
Mm.
Um, and so that's in quite a solid thing. It then started to get a bit shaky when they did things like we're on the wrong side of the War of Independence in America.
Mm.
That wasn't a moment where he shone. Though I don't
Yeah.
think he actually resembles at all the wonderful cameo that's in
In
Hamilton,
Hamilton,
which
yes.
everybody cheers.
Oh yes,
He
yes.
wasn't quite as Machiavellian as that chap.
I think what everyone forgets at the time, or sorry, now rather, with hindsight and with our modern views and things like that, America, well, bits of America were British. It was our colony, and it was we actually protected the colony from the deprivations of the French. And then when we wanted to tax people to say, we need some money for this, they said, actually, no, we're not going to pay you after all.
Yeah,
That's a very sort of generalized
that's the
view of things.
pro-British.
Yes,
That's the
that's a
pro. That
pro-British
doesn't
thing.
get into Hamilton. That
But
view.
no, and to be honest with you, Julia, as you know, with your globetrotting, trying to hold on to anything when you're miles away from it, as Napoleon found out as well, um, is a bit of an impossible struggle. If someone really doesn't want to be colonized or doesn't want your rule anymore, you're always going to be constantly dividing your forces, trying to put out fires here, there, and everywhere. So I think
Yeah.
it was inevitable that America would become its own country.
Yeah.
And I think George probably had to accept that by the end. But
That
initially, I'm sure all his advisors were saying, hold on to this new rich country. It's there to be, a great power.
So that puts me in mind of a possible podcast of what would Jane do about America. But let's park that on one side. I
That's
bet
a whole other
that'll
podcast.
get a lot of listens. That one. So moving on. So you've got George the Third, with and he has a range of children,
Mm,
and there are, I'd say, three notable sons.
mm.
I may be wrong. There may be another one. But anyway,
Yes.
let's start with the future George the Fourth. We've mentioned already he gets married illegally under the rules of the day, so that lady is set aside. Poor Mrs. Fitzherbert.
Mm.
He has numerous mistresses, of course, but he does get married to like a suitable woman.
Yeah, a suitable
Um,
woman that hates him.
yeah, called Caroline of Brunswick. That is an utter disaster. So if
Yes.
Mrs. Fitzherbert is kind of his Camilla, the
Yes.
woman he loved, Caroline is like some Princess Di on steroids. I mean, she's just such a different character. But she was in that invidious position that she fell out with her
Yes.
husband. They managed to produce one daughter, one legitimate
Mm,
heir,
mm.
Princess Charlotte.
Yes.
And then it just became majorly ugly. I mean, everything.
Yes.
She had supporters in Parliament. It divided the politics, but
Yes.
the supporters tended to be on the more radical side, and they just
Mm.
wanted her to go away and shut up, which is typical for reaction to any woman who goes against the grain. So there's like this
Yeah.
ongoing major issue that carries on throughout Jane's life.
Yes.
And
And
she's
that's the thing, as it sounds stupid, but division at the top of the tree leads to division everywhere else.
yeah,
So it's important to maintain that spectacle, even, whatever's going on behind closed doors. If you have open division in your ruling house, that's going to spread down and make the rest of the country unstable. So I'm sure a lot of politicians were very worried about their royal getting lampooned constantly in the press and all the caricatures flying around, just as they are today. When the press get hold of some juicy stories, they will always try and subdue that, because it just makes everyone, including the country, look bad. And if you are setting yourself up as the family that represents Great Britain, you better be people worth respecting,
maybe
because otherwise Great Britain
maybe it
suffers as a
was
consequence.
maybe it was strangely appropriate, in terms of the things that were going on in society. It was a time of
Mm.
turmoil and
Oh
change.
yes, it
So
was.
just carrying on with that story, it goes beyond Jane's life, that when you get to the coronation of George the Fourth, there's this worry that she's going to appear and sort of
Yes,
demand a role.
like Maleficent.
Yeah, it's it's the ex-wife turning up kind of thing. Well, she's not
No,
divorced,
no,
but
she's still,
she's
yes,
still
very
wife,
much.
but the
Mm.
estranged, separated wife.
Yes.
Okay, and when within that, finishing off this part of the family
Hmm.
tree, you do have the hope of the nation, which is Princess Charlotte. Now, she's handed over to be raised by, a series of nannies and noble ladies. I found out just recently through my reading that her sort of main person who looked after her was the Dowager Lady Elgin, who is the mother of the Lord Elgin of the Marbles fame.
Hmm. Hmm.
And she was actually known to be quite fair. She didn't treat, she apparently tried to allow Princess Charlotte to appreciate both her parents. Tough role, that one.
Yes, very tough.
And there was a fairy tale princess aspect to Princess Charlotte. She had a big royal wedding in 1816, which Jane would obviously known about and remembered.
Mm.
But there is a tragedy to this, in that she dies in 1817, obviously around the same time as Jane Austen passed away.
Mm.
She died in childbirth, and it was a huge scandal.
Mm.
And as a result, there was a rethink about childbirth, but it was too late, and health
Mm.
issues, because they didn't understand about cross contamination and
No.
complications following birth.
Mm.
Um, so she died, perhaps left a bit of a legacy in terms of rethink of how people are looked after in childbirth, but it was a very sad end, and it fitted with
Mm.
that idea of um, the royal family in turmoil. So no legitimate heir. Step along. You've got two royal dukes. You've got the Duke of York, who spends quite a lot of time in real charge of the army,
Hmm.
but he's a working prince with a key role in the Napoleonic War. And you've got the Duke of Clarence, who is another of the royal dukes. I think he had more to do with the navy.
Mm. Yes.
Which is the one who's Dora Jordan's lover? Is it Clarence?
Probably Clarence. And I think
Yeah.
it's interesting that the Duke of York was so famous for being a military man. That's obviously where we get the nursery rhyme, the grand old Duke of York. He had 10,000 men. He marched them up to the top of the hill, and he marched them down again. But that survives. And that survives because obviously of his time, he was famous. He was well known, not necessarily appreciated, but
Yeah, and
there were still military battles to be won and honours to be shared out.
probably just need to quickly Google this, but I'm thinking, fast forwarding, I think he's the one who actually succeeds George when George dies, and there's a
Mm.
brief period of William being king, and then it's his daughter, Queen Victoria. Aha,
Yes.
here we come.
Aha.
Who then takes over. I mean, again, a complicated upbringing for her, but
Yes.
she is 15, 2 decades later, roughly,
Yes.
taking
Yes.
on the role that they thought Princess Charlotte would be taking, and I think she does save the monarchy just by the virtue of the fact that she shakes off all the tawdry stuff of her previous generation, lives for a long time,
Mm.
and
Yes. Outlives all the
projects. Yeah,
scandals and
but that
trials of her first years. Yeah.
but that is not known
No.
to
No.
Jane. So
No.
we
At
are
all.
in the massive turmoil stage.
Mm.
Um, what we didn't mention, of course, is that the king himself is suffering periodic
mental health
episodes.
issues.
I
Yes.
don't think it's mental health. I think he has a physical illness,
Oh yeah.
which
Can't even remember the
produces
name. It's begin with P. I can't even remember the
yeah.
Porphyry that I can't pronounce. Yes, yes,
Um,
poor chap. Yes.
they're not sure of his diagnosis, actually. I've noticed more
Mm.
recently, but he had something which
Yeah.
meant he had this cyclical thing.
Mm.
And then eventually in 1811, it doesn't go away.
Mm.
And that's when you get the Regency. So if you're wondering, when does the Regency start? It is 1811,
Mm-hmm.
which goes on to the death of George III. And why didn't you get a Regency earlier if dear old dad was clearly struggling with his health?
Mm.
The reason was that the Prince Regent was most closely associated with the radicals in Parliament, or those on the Whig side, people
Mm.
like Sheridan, Fox when he was alive, people like that. And they thought that by making him king, it would mean a change of government, and the Conservatives, the Tories, would be booted out. What actually happened is Prince Regent did what Hal does in Henry the Fourth Part Two, which
Mm-hmm.
is he basically kicks his full staff to the curb. Um, in this case, that's regarded as Sheridan,
Mm.
says, I am going to compromise and I'll work with the men in power. We're at war. No
Yes.
time for my sort of younger days carousing. I've got to be sensible. And he fell out with Sheridan over Catholic emancipation, which
Mm.
meant Sheridan wanted him to carry out his promise to allow people who are Roman Catholic to hold positions of, like go to university and
Yes,
be in
exactly.
government,
Not too
be
much to ask.
equal.
Yes.
Yeah. But it was too much to ask at
But
the
apparently it
time.
was. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it had to wait quite a long time before that legal system was
Mm.
changed.
Mm.
So that was what was going on there. So when you look at the summary, I suppose, is the royal family was in far more of a fix than our current royal family. It meant far more in terms of how the politics were decided, had far more central role. And I think it was saved by the fact that society couldn't imagine itself without being a monarchy. It didn't want to be a republic or an
Well,
empire
it had
like
already gone
Napoleon.
through being
Yeah.
without a monarchy, let's not forget. It found out exactly what happened when they beheaded a king and put somebody else that wasn't royal in his place. And, it's be careful what you wish for. Oliver Cromwell was just as bad, if not worse, some might argue, than royals that had gone before, and created just as much destruction in trying to secure his own position. And I think it's very difficult, isn't it, to say, are we better off with a monarchy or without a monarchy? And I think that today's current royal family are very conscious that if people decide we no longer need one, uh, they're out. So I don't think they ever forget that they're there with the will of the people. Um, and it was a very real danger that we could have gone without a monarchy, or we could have had, the worry was that Britain was going to copy France and have a revolution,
Mm.
thanks to incredible poverty, as you say, the absolute change going on all over the world, not just Europe at the time. It could have so easily gone that direction. And I think that was possibly why the Tories particularly were so worried about losing power. Um, yes, mainly for their own power bases, but also because they could see how terribly France was suffering once that imbalance happened, and it went from being a revolution that I would say possibly needed to happen because the upper classes had lost so much touch with what was actually happening to their people. People were really genuinely suffering. Um, but as so often happens, the seesaw swung the other way, and it led to an enormous power grab with everybody who'd overthrown the royalty becoming almost their own demons, and being just as bad, if not worse, and mass executions and people dobbing each other in, I dare say, and ultimately somebody declaring himself emperor. So we've ousted a king, but you're now better than a king. So I think we're very lucky we didn't have a revolution. We had an industrial revolution later on, or was starting to happen at the time, but everything was up for grabs at that point, and I could see how the royal family and people around them would have been incredibly worried at the time that due to the king's unfortunate instability and the Prince Regent seeming to be a man of the people, and he was in his youth very much fated as a genial, handsome, charming young man, and I feel very, very sorry for. I know it sounds strange to say, for the princes in waiting. So the Prince Regent was one, and Charles was another. I mean, Charles is what, 70 now? So
oh, and the rest. He's
and
much
the rest.
more. Yeah.
Not that age has anything to do with it, I'm sure. But very much like the Prince Regent, he's been brought up all his life being told, you are going to be king one day, you're going to be king one day, and then denied it and denied it and denied it. Now, I'm not saying that the Queen was wonderful and her middle name was Duty, and probably, cut her open and it'll be carved through her heart. And she did pretty much die in harness as she'd given her life to the country. So she was raised with the value of duty and service. And I think that's what a lot of people forget, is that when you are crowned, as in this country at least, you are dedicating your life to the people. And they might say, oh, well, what a cushy life. But it's not really. You couldn't pay me to be a royal.
Yeah, I think, because this is about the perspective from then, casting forward. And I think what was going on then was those who were not keen. There were Republican thinkers in the sort of population.
No,
they didn't want a violent revolution like the one that had turned out in France. Who would? I mean, that'd be crazy to wish that.
Horrific.
They were at war, so obviously you don't want to change something fundamental. It's like what happened during
war.
like what happened in the First World War.
They're already fighting on all fronts.
Yeah, like Russia had a change with the Bolsheviks. They didn't know about that, obviously, but that it's not something that the majority wanted.
No,
and there was an element of better the devil you know, or if it ain't broke, don't
yes, absolutely.
Those sorts of thoughts, which I think kept the conservatism with a small c in place, which meant there was no serious challenge to have a different form of government at the time. So let's go back to Jane Austen.
Yes.
There is, before we look at her characters and her books and her attitudes to monarchy, there is one famous interaction with a royal. There's not many, almost no mention of royalty at all anywhere, which is interesting in itself. It's not something she spent a lot of time thinking about, it would seem.
Well, it wasn't the circle she moved in, let's not forget. Everybody keeps thinking of her as upper class, and she was, I would say, firmly middle class, if anything.
But she's also not sort of gossiping about it.
No. And they would have gossiped at the time, just like you cannot walk into a newsagent's today and not see some royal plastered over Hello magazine or something like that. They were just the same. Nothing ever changes in some respects. In Regency times, you couldn't walk past a print shop without seeing the latest royal scandal caricature. People would want to read everything they could get their hands on about Princess Charlotte's wedding dress and all the rest of it. There was just as much hunger, if not more, for how these godlike people live their lives then as there are today. People love gossiping about people who seemingly have better lives than they do and all the money. It's a fairy tale, and it is unrealistic fairy tale for anyone who's anything about history. But people love a fairy tale, and that's. You saw it with Charles and Diana. You saw it with Princess Charlotte and her husband. People want to believe the hype and that somebody somewhere is having a great life, even if they're not, and they can live vicariously through that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the function, isn't it?
So
that's it's possible, of course, just to be fair to history, that we don't have the complete set of her correspondence. Maybe there's lots
No.
of, I hate the royals letters, or I love the royals,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
Cassandra weeded out. Who knows? But her growing fame towards the end of her life with her novels coming out meant that she became someone to whom those in power, famous literary figures, would know the name of and would write to and appreciate. And unfortunately for her, one of the people who decided to appreciate her was the Prince Regent. And then this landed her in a very funny dilemma, which is that when Emma comes out in, I think that's 1816, isn't it?
16, possibly.
Let me just check.
Maybe a little early.
Yeah, 1816
Yeah,
is Emma.
well remembered.
The librarian, the Prince Regent's librarian, says he'd very much like it if you would dedicate your book to him.
In the way of a royal command, and you will
Yeah,
dedicate your book to him, won't you?
Yes. So she gets this edict, and of course you can't say, well, actually, no, I'd much prefer to get dedicated to my mum. She couldn't do that. So this is the dedication at the beginning of Emma, and it stands out because there is nothing comparable anywhere else in the novel. She hasn't done this in any of the others. It's to His Royal Highness the Prince Regent. This work is by His Royal Highness's permission, read command, most respectfully dedicated to His Royal Highness's dutiful, by His Royal Highness's dutiful and obedient humble servant, the author. Now, by the time we get to dutiful and obedient humble servant, the author, I'm beginning to snigger because I'm thinking,
she must have been writing that through gritted teeth, or certainly with a lot of irony. So it's like, heck, I'm humble, but I'm having to do this, so I'm going to do it.
I would imagine that, let's allow her mixed feelings, because to be noticed, be a
it's
little,
an honor. It is an honor.
You're a little lady writing in a house in the country, loved amongst your friends, but you're not really known. And then
one of the highest personages in the land notices you. Yeah.
So I suppose there must have been a sense of, oh, I've arrived as an author, which let's give her that. But also because of his complexity as a father, husband, royal, brother, son, and so on, Prince Regent is probably not the one she might have chosen. I can imagine she'd have been happier if it had been Princess Charlotte.
With him if she'd met him in real life. Yes, Princess Charlotte she might have approved of more.
Yeah.
But as you say, it's one offer you can't refuse. It would have certainly helped her book sales. So maybe she was being businesslike and thinking of that. And yes, you can't help as an author, I'm sure, being flattered that somebody recognises your work and actually wants the work dedicated to them. So whether you approve of the person or not, it's still an honor. Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's Jane's one known interaction where she does acquiesce with, one imagines, some reluctance, but off she goes, and so that's there for us all to see. Okay, now let's think about Jane Austen's novels and what we can tell from her attitudes to royalty within the novels. I think we'll have to expand that to nobility because, as I said, there is actually a huge silence.
Well, I'm sure there's a huge silence because she didn't really know. Nobody really knew what was going on with the royals. I mean, far less than we do today, where we know what they have for breakfast, we know who their servants' names are and things like that. They wouldn't have known it to that much of a degree. It would have been like hearing about people in some distant land, and if you were lucky, you might see them roll past you on a festival day, but you wouldn't have interacted with them as a normal person at all.
It would have been interesting if she'd got to finish Sanditon, because Sanditon is obviously quite close to the Brighton, Bognor Regis, those southern resorts by the sea, which were associated with the Prince Regent and his set. It would have been interesting if they, who knows? I could imagine some sense of some more noble figure in that might have had echoes, but she obviously didn't get. So that's the novel that's not written. That's what I would have done with Sanditon. Anyway,
And I think more recently, wasn't Hilary Mantel working on a Jane Austen opus?
Yes,
Don't know quite what that was about.
Hilary Mantel had quite an acerbic,
Mm,
yeah. She I think because she decided to make Thomas Cromwell relatable
yes.
when the rest of history had made him a villain, I suspect she'd have turned Jane Austen into something completely the opposite. But
Yes,
anyway,
yes. But
she
who
also
knows? Again, we
didn't
will
get a
never know.
chance.
We will never know.
Yeah. Um, so what about in the novels? Did you get any sense of what she might think of royal people from the way she treats those with titles in her books?
I think just like all of her other characters, she would have presented uh, them as possibly figures of fun, possibly uh, people to be pitied somewhat sometimes. Just as flawed as the rest of us, basically, and that's what makes her characters so compelling. You can say uh, Lady Catherine de Bourgh is a bit of a caricature, but she still comes across as a rounded human being rather than a caricature to me. Her motives are compelling. She tells people what to do, and you can say, she's got no right to do that, but of course she thinks she's got perfect right to do that by right of owning just about everybody and everything around her. Of course, you can tell them what to do, and she's doing it. Um, she will probably think with the best of motives to make their lives better and more ordered. So obviously, Jane Austen is poking fun at those more privileged who thought they could order everyone around them, and that's very clear from her side of the story. But you can understand the motivations of her upper classes, even if you don't agree with them. They're not coming from a place of total non-understanding of their position, if that makes any sense. I think although she necessarily didn't move in those circles, she could have some understanding through possibly her brother Edward Knight's connections to not upper classes necessarily, but certainly a higher class. She must have observed some people at balls from a distance, even, and how they behave towards other people. But I
Yeah.
think
Mm.
it's just it's just another class to be poked fun at, and you can poke more fun at people who have more reason to behave better than the rest of us, but usually behave worse because of with great, as I say, great power and great wealth comes excess, and pride and vanity, and everything is exaggerated. So they would have been ripe fruit, I would say, to any author.
I
That's
think that
indeed.
I think in some sense the she's positioned a bit like Fanny in
Mm,
Mansfield Park to the goings on of that family. Because if you look in her letters, the one reference I could find to court is she's at a house where the ladies of the house she's at go to court, visit
mm,
court, and come back bearing the tale that, Princess Louisa wasn't looking in the best looks. It's very much I'm staying behind, others are going to these
mm,
exotic places.
mm,
She would, of course, had one particular interest, which is that her favourite writer, Fanny Burney, was
mm,
a lady in waiting to the Queen
mm.
for some of these years until her marriage. So she would have had, I think that would have intrigued her, but Fanny Burney hated the job,
I
by the
think
way.
anyone with any sense would have done
Yeah, I
because it
think
must have
she,
been most boring,
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
thankless,
It was
just
really boring.
slog of a job.
Uh,
Oh yeah.
she's her. If you want to read about an insight into the court from that perspective, her letters, Fanny Burney's letters, do cover it. So
Mm.
you can get your fix there. You can't get your fix from Jane Austen. Okay, so I think we've had a look at the contemporary setting. So and we've made a couple of comments about uh, the current royal family, but we need to answer the question of what would Jane do about King Charles III. So I think there are a number of ways of answering this, aren't there? You go with yours, and then I'll.
I I um I think she would have been intrigued. He's starting off from a point of being raised to be king all of his life, and very much like the Prince Regent would have done, he would have had thousands of people all around him putting their oar in and saying, "This is what I think a king should be." And I think Jane Austen would probably be struck with he's starting out with a new reign with an awful lot of expectation on his shoulders and in a very difficult position. He's taking over. If you look at, they call themselves the firm these days. He's taking over a business that is floundering about and has possibly failed to keep up with the modern age, and with the competition, if you like, from other businesses to take over. So he's not in a position of, I would say, great power. He's still got an enormous amount of wealth. But I think she would have been interested to see what he made of the role and the possibilities that now stretch before him, and to see if he could become his own man, and not be swayed by the many people around whom are all fighting for a piece of power. But I think the main thing about our monarchy is it acts as a sort of a buffer to stop politicians becoming the ultimate power. And I think, as we've seen, it's never a good thing, in my mind at least, for anyone to have ultimate power. So we've got politicians, we've got the church, and of course, to consolidate their power, the royal family has always been part of the church and sort of taken on that mantle. But you've got several people, none of whom are in ultimate power, and I think that's a good thing. So I think from that point of view, and Jane Austen would have been aware of this, with the way the church uses its own power, and I'm sure she would have I'm sure she would have been interested anyway in the jostlings to see who could come on top and how power is maintained.
Okay, so I think number one, Jane Austen wouldn't write a novel about it.
No, I don't think so.
Number two, I think she would be at Chawton putting up the bunting, having a tea, having a good old party with her friends and a gossip, because that is what you should do with a coronation. If you're not invited, you should just have fun and celebrate community and historic. Oh, we should mention, of course, she wrote History of the Kings and Queens of
Oh
England.
yes,
Oh
of
yeah,
course she
I mean,
did.
sorry guys, you're all
Yes,
shouting at the podcast.
Yeah.
She was quite acerbic in she doesn't like royals unless they're likable. So, you can see she may have done an addendum to that where she'd put her little, Queen Elizabeth II, good egg, Charles III, let's wait and see. I don't know. You could see her doing that. But I think what she would be interested in him as a story, let's think about him as a story, is that I'm interested in this as a writer, is that to borrow a title from Trollope, the 19th century writer, is Can You Forgive Him? And I think there's a really interesting story arc with Charles. There are some people here who haven't got over the fact that his fairy tale wedding didn't turn out to be a fairy tale.
Yes,
it turned out to, well, maybe there was hope. I don't know.
Well, yes, I think a lot of people were very hopeful, including the royal family, and I'm sure Charles and Diana went into it with the best hopes that
they didn't know. They didn't know what's going to happen.
No, of course not.
2020 hindsight. It's that thing.
Yes, it is.
But there's another way of telling the story, of course, which is you have made mistakes and possibly things which would amount to a sin in a Jane Austen sense. Can you be forgiven? Well, of course, from a Christian faith point of view, which was Jane's belief,
upbringing,
is that you should offer forgiveness. That should be default method. So she'd have moved on. And then you've got because otherwise nobody can ever be pure enough to satisfy everybody. It's just none of us can.
It's an impossible role.
Yeah. So I think she would probably not be amongst those who would say, "Oh, we can't possibly have a Queen Camilla." She'd actually say, "Well, can you forgive them?" Yes, because we all do rubbish things, particularly when we're younger and if we're under pressure and all that sort of thing. I think she would also have pity for him as a father with warring sons. because clearly families fall out. But part of the reason they're falling out is because they are in the monarchy. So there's an unequal treatment between the eldest and the follow-up son, the spare. And that is the same as would have happened in her aristocratic
Oh, yes.
families. And in
Yes.
her own family, her brother, Edward, isn't it,
Yes.
is adopted and whisked away to be the heir to a great fortune.
Mm.
And the rest of them had to, be
Love
vicars
it.
and
Yes.
risk their lives at sea. And there was no bitterness in that family that
No,
one
that was
can
probably seen
sense.
as very good fortune
Yeah.
for Edward, at least, and by association, them, I'm sure. And if you think they were a large family, and Jane Austen, several times in her life, was living in poverty because they all had to make their own
Yeah.
way. And people will probably say, well, why didn't Edward help his sister more? Well, he did help her. He gave her a nice cottage in Chawton, and I'm sure he helped her as much as he could. But ultimately, it, it, um,
Ultimately, it wasn't fair.
it wasn't fair. No,
But,
that was life.
yeah, welcome to life, guys. So I think she'd be sympathetic on that. And then I think the third thing she'd be interested in is his clearly less, he did say at one point in his life he wants to feel as though he's defending all faiths. And I can
Hmm.
see the logic of that in our current multicultural society. Doesn't
Yes.
mean he doesn't have his own personal faith or whatever sort.
No. No.
Just means that it's a kind of equal status. Under an established church,
Yes.
you should be able to say that established church will protect other faiths, not persecute them, because there's been plenty of times in history where
Oh,
the
yes.
established
And
church
that
has
only
been
ever causes
persecuted.
discord.
Yeah. So I think she would be really interested in that. And if she was a modern woman now, I think she would be wishing him well with that, however it's expressed at the coronation.
Hmm.
Um, so I think, what would she do about Charles III? I think she'd raise a glass, she'd wish him luck, she would be amused by some of the shenanigans, but she wouldn't be writing about it.
No, because
Or
again,
podcasting about it.
yeah, it's all podcasting about it. And I generally, if I think about it at all, think the monarchy is flawed but a good thing. I would rather have a monarchy than not have a monarchy because, well, for many reasons I won't go into here, but I've expressed some of them. But I ultimately think, yes, she would approve of how they're trying to make themselves better and trying to go about things the best way they can. It's an impossible job, let's face it. Um, but I was very amused when I was thinking about riots, revolution, bloodshed in other countries still going on, unfortunately, and how are we celebrating? All these great celebrations. Sainsbury's and other supermarkets are saying have special offers on scones and cream tea. So it's not sort of get absolutely legless as people might suppose about the British. But no, have a cream tea in celebration. I
Yeah,
think how British.
they leave the get legless for football.
Yes, exactly, for sport, which is far more important. Obviously,
Yeah.
it's life and death. But so your new king is being crowned, and there's potentially
Make
the
cake. Make
prospect of
cake.
make cake while the sun shines. Yes, I
It's not
think
let them eat cake, it's make cake.
make your own cake. Yes.
Then eat it. Um, yeah, no, I suppose I agree. The polls show that younger people are less likely to support the Ros, but I think that's always been the case. And I think that's
Yeah.
partly the thing that when you're younger, you think, let's change
Yeah,
everything.
exactly, and that's absolutely that. And I was very interested to also read that the polls of over 75s or something were much more in favour of
Yeah,
monarchy because
the graph follows age.
they've
Yeah.
lived through more interesting times and they can see the alternatives. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not going to be out there saying what's it? People are going to be out there saying he's not my king. Well, yeah, he is
Hmm.
my king, and
Yes.
I
Like
actually
it or not.
I like the idea of using a reign to sort of package up history. I like it as a storyteller. I like that
Hmm.
idea of, I find it much more relatable than Callahan or Thatcher.
Hmm.
Who remembers exactly those days?
Hmm.
I like that. So, but I do think there's an argument against monarchy in that it's can be cruel to the people involved. And if they stop
Yes.
wanting to do it, I think we should,
Support that.
elect, President Gary Lineker or something. I don't know. But you can imagine it
Yes.
becomes an awful. I quite like there's that little guy over in Ireland. Is it Bertie? Who's the little guy?
Bertie Ahern?
Is it the little
No?
who looks like a leprechaun? He's great. You can imagine having a really cute like Judi Dench or something. But
Yes.
I think I'd prefer to wait until they say, had enough.
Yes.
Go and do
It's
it.
time to call it a day. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so there you are. That's they're obviously listening to us, and we'll do
Of
everything.
course they are. Of
Yeah.
course they are. And I think, as a someone who loves history, as I know you do as well,
Mm.
it's the idea of a fairly unbroken monarchy I like. I like the longevity of it. I like the ceremonies and the history behind it. And if somebody who knows nothing about kings and queens looks at the ceremony today, which has probably not much changed since King George's day, I'm sure he'd recognise everything in that. Um, there's all the anointings and the wearings of special crowns and
Yeah.
the church ceremonies that go with it, that are sacred, that are religious, and that have deep, deep historical meanings, even though they mean probably nothing to anyone who doesn't know anything about what's gone before and would seem very, very odd. But you can't deny um, that I would say the British do ceremony and history better than almost anybody else in the world.
Well, I'm sure somebody can find it. I don't
Somebody
know.
will.
It's
Somebody
probably
will.
Japan or something. Just correction. It's Michael D. Higgins.
Oh, right. Sorry, Michael
Which
D.
I
Higgins.
did as soon as I saw the name, I thought, yeah, of course it's him. Sorry, guys, we got that slightly wrong, but it's equally delightful. I think I could imagine a presidency where you have a succession of people like that who, in a different
Mm,
way, sum up something about the country. But
mm,
um, the thing I like most about the coronation ceremony is the bit that they're talking about where it's screened off. But actually, I
mm.
like
It's
what happens
private.
there,
Yes.
which is he's stripped of, or as the queen was, take off all
Mm,
the robes, and you are anointed as a person, like without the crown.
mm.
I like the humbleness of that moment.
And it should be humble. I like the fact that if they're honest about it, they do say, I am in service to my people. My life is dedicated to them. It's not about me, me, me. And I think that's a very important part of the service, and a part that a lot of people, well, a lot of people like read Jane Austen, but superficially don't appreciate is the fact that yes, have enormous wealth, you potentially have enormous power, but ultimately your life is not your own. It is dedicated to the service of your people, your country, and that is something that, unless you're in the armed forces, possibly that a lot of people don't really think much about today.
Oh, if you're
Um,
in the civil service, or
if you're in
sorry,
the civil service, you do, of
the
course.
diplomatic service, I've got a scroll somewhere in a drawer because I used to be in the Foreign Office, which
That's right.
says, "I'm a trusty and well beloved servant."
Yeah.
I loved it.
I do. I love things like that.
Because of course it's the crown, not the person. Anyway,
Yeah.
right. I think
Yes.
we've explored that nice and fully, and I will
So
certainly be making cake and eating cake.
I'll have a scone in celebration
Yeah.
of Jane Austen as well as the King.
Yes.
But I must say, as a reenactor, it's nice to say, "Huzzah! Long live the King," and be able to relate it to today's King as
Yes. Yes.
well.
The change of words. So, do we have a Darcy and a Wickham of the week,
Oh
or
well,
the month, in fact, because we've
all the
not
month
spoken for a
indeed.
while?
Yes, we're in the month of April. So all I could find for Darcy is not a person; it's a thing,
Yeah.
and that is the humble Jaffa cake.
Okay.
Scientists have used their science to determine that the Jaffa cake is the best dunking biscuit in Britain. I love the fact that someone
Breaking news.
somewhere who is a scientist has committed many hours to dunking biscuits to determine which is the best dunker. And the Jaffa cake apparently can be dunked about 115 times without losing its substance, whereas the humble digestive can only be dunked about 6 times before losing its substance. And of course, again, I love this as a British person. The Times queried this, saying, "Why would anyone be degenerate enough to dunk a Jaffa cake anyway?" I love that there's a letter to the Times. There's always a letter to the every possible subject. And then my Wickham of the week.
Oh, let me do my Darcy before we do
sorry. Do
Wickham's.
your Darcy. Do your Darcy.
So there's several contenders. I was reading a story about this morning about a very brave young man in America who stopped a bus when the school bus driver had passed out. So he was a hero. But actually, well done, that chap who's 13. But actually, I was thinking that dear old Len Goodman, who died, who was one of the judges on Strictly Come Dancing. Yeah. The reason I'm choosing him is because reading his obituary, it turned out that he was actually a last-minute replacement when it started airing.
Yes.
Seems like years ago, but I think it's and what I think he did was that because he was this East Ender with a sort of, for those listening in England, we could tell his accent was, kind of
not the Queen's English.
Barra, his uncle had a Barra down the market, I think he showed that you didn't have to be
from Eton.
No, well, there's a certain
yes,
sort of the sparkly,
yes.
Bruno Tonioni and
Arlene Phillips, is it?
Oh, I mean, they're more sort of showy.
And Craig Revel Horwood.
Yeah, they're all kind of on the and quite a few.
Len was very down to earth and very relatable, and I think that's, as we often said, that's why people love Jane Austen so, is that she seems like your best friend, giggling with you in a corner at an assembly, pointing out all the foibles, and you can feel that you'd like to meet her.
He seemed like the man who would go with his wife to the tea dance. You know what I mean? At that level, rather than the person who'd be wearing, glitter and pastels on stage. Tiaras, yeah. So I thought, and he had a funny turn of phrase. So I think he did a very good job for those of you who like ballroom dancing, which is probably many as you're listening to a Jane Austen podcast. I think he helped set the tone for a whole series of dancing shows, because he also went over to America to judge.
Yes, absolutely. And I think especially in those sorts of shows, the judges can come across, well, I know they set them up to be sometimes as quite cruel and snooty and vindictive and criticizing people to the end. And he never came across as that, even when he had to say your dancing's not great. He always found a kind positive way of putting a spin on it. And he was always, I think that was my impression of him the most as a judge, was he was very kind and he just wanted the best for people and to promote dancing, as something that is enjoyable for everybody.
And so it leads to my Wickham, which of course is everybody's Wickham, which is cancer, because he died at 78 of cancer, and he's not the only person. We hear tragic early deaths all the time. So that is and will always be my Wickham. And so good luck to those people who are trying to find a cure.
Perhaps you
could do a lighter note, Wickham, for us.
I can. And again, I think Jane Austen would have definitely liked poking fun at this Wickham. Elon Musk.
Oh, right. Thank you.
The continuing saga of Elon Musk, who has apparently bought Twitter, was warned by Twitter, the group, that if he was basically telling his high-profile users of Twitter that he was going to remove their verification ticks. And again, this is a whole other podcast.
This saga's been running for some time.
Genuine. Yeah. How do you prove on social media you are who you say you are, or your stories indeed are what you say they are? So his solution to people not subscribing or paying for Twitter content was to remove the verification blue checks from accounts to encourage users to pay for the subscription. This lasted about 5 days because he was warned, as happened, that all his high profile VIP users of Twitter would leave in droves. And then this was constantly, basically what happened was all the blue ticks suddenly reappeared a few days later, whether the high profile users wanted them or not, apparently.
Yeah, and you got this ridiculous thing of people saying, I didn't pay.
Not my Twitter.
It's been I've actually come off Twitter because I don't want to be involved in this thing. I used to be on Twitter, but
No, Facebook's enough for me. I can't handle more than one social media. That takes
Yeah.
up way too much of my time. And I mainly got on Facebook in the first place just to share reenactment photos with my reenactment cronies.
Mm.
And if you're not careful, you're a bit of a slave to, I suppose, like in a little village, in Jane Austen's little village, seeing what your friends and not even friends really, other people are up to,
Mm.
and sort of gossip and, in my case, lots of cat videos. But it's a tool like any other,
Yeah.
like a novel. You can use it for good, you can use it for ill, you can use it to point out the social foibles of the day. Um, so it's the cat's out of the bag now. You can't put it back in, so you've got to learn to live with it or use it as best you can.
So we got another subject we could tackle is after America is what would Jane do about the blue tick? But just to finish off because we've run a
Yes,
bit long here.
sorry.
No, no, I've been having fun.
Good.
Hope the listeners have too. Um, we should share some Jane Austen news. Have you got anything that you'd like to share?
Well, what have I got to share? Caroline Knight, Jane Austen's great probably niece, is spearheading a fundraising effort for Chawton House. And lots of people saying, well, Chawton House is a great house. Why does it need money? And it needs money like any great house needs money because it hasn't got enough to safeguard its future.
Mhm.
So hopefully we can put a link on this podcast. But I know Jane Austen fans around the world are already donating to try and save it. I think it needs an awful lot of money, about £200,000. And it's not just for next year's running fees. It's not that shallow. It's to safeguard it for the next hopefully 25 years or something. And Chawton House is particularly to be preserved in my view because it has a wonderful library. So not just because Jane Austen went there and probably wrote at least some bits of her novels, which is reason enough, but and it's still um, served by the Knight family, who've lived there for many years. You can often find Mr. Knight leading tours and telling about Jane Austen in Chawton House. But it's got a wonderful library with particular emphasis on women's works as well. It's open to everybody who books to go in, and they promote literacy, and it's a wonderful legacy for the Knight family to leave behind. So I think it's worth protecting.
Great. So I've got a couple of bits of news.
Mm-hmm.
Um, two are sort of selfish. One is my Jane Austen Investigate series has gone into Polish. So
Oh,
hopefully there'll be
well
a
done.
Polish translation soon to join the
Mm-hmm.
existing French one, which is great. Um, and also on a recent trip to Bath for a sort of, a wedding anniversary visit,
Mm-hmm.
I want to recommend Tea at the Pump Room. If you go to Bath, book yourself in because it is absolutely delightful.
It is a
There's somebody
treat,
playing the
yes.
piano. You can drink
You feel like
waters.
royalty with or
Yeah,
without a tiara.
have the bun. The bun's great.
You can even
Uh,
drink waters should you really wish to.
I did that too. I got photographic evidence.
Well
Um,
done.
So yeah, just remembering how wonderful Bath is. Do go and
Mm.
visit. And then the thing that I did do is I also went earlier this week to see the cabaret show Ostentatious in London,
Oh,
which
did
is
you? I
quite.
love them.
I absolutely hated it.
Did you?
Yeah. So there you go. You've got a completely mixed view. Absolutely hated it because I
I think
thought
it
these.
depends which night you go. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work
Yeah,
so well.
they knew nothing about Jane Austen, as far as I could tell. They were basing it off Bridgerton in a very sort of so
Bridgerton's
I
rather sort of superseded Jane Austen in the public
yeah,
mind of what the Regency is. So
I
that's
didn't find
yes.
it at all clever or funny. So,
Mm,
but
mm.
maybe, as you say, maybe it was an off night.
Yes,
Um,
it can vary hugely.
yeah. So, for me, it's a I very rarely take against something. For
You
me, it
do.
was, I really want to like things about Jane Austen, but for me, it was like a 1 star out of 5. Whereas when you saw it, maybe it was a better cast on a better night with a wittier sort of,
Yes, it is. It is. It's. I mean, improvisation, which is what they do, is always
yeah.
very, very difficult. So you either sort of take an idea and really run with it and have a lot of fun with it, or you have an idea that doesn't really go anywhere, and you have to kind of just work with what you've got.
Yeah, there was my reason for being critical is there was
Yes.
no connection with Jane Austen.
No, no, at
There
all.
was no
And as a
Easter
Jane Austen lover,
eggs.
that's a bit of
Yeah,
a shame, isn't it?
nobody
Yes.
I could say, oh yes, look, that's a Mr. Elton, or that's a
Yes, yes,
or the Baruch Landau. You could have
yes.
fun with just
Oh,
dropping a few
yes,
of
you
these things
could.
in.
Yeah.
Uh, so I kind of feel, oh no, that was an evening. I really, it was. I felt bad because it was a wedding. It
Mhm.
was a
Oh, a
birthday
wedding.
present from
Yes,
my
yes.
daughter to me, who was with me,
Oh,
and I felt terrible because I wanted to say I love this, but I actually was. I want to leave. I want to leave.
well, try. I can recommend Austen Undone at the Jane Austen Festival. They're
Okay.
another group. They're not so. They will have. They are improv sort of, but they involve the audience in what they do, and they do
Mm.
base everything they do on Jane Austen
It
stories.
is funny because I'm sure somebody else sitting in that show would have thought, oh, that was a great night out.
Hmm.
But yeah,
When you
I
want more
just,
Jane Austen and less Bridgerton, yes, I can see
yeah.
how that would be
So a
disappointing.
caveat, if you're going to go see that
Yes.
show, you
Hmm.
could be like Kate and love it, or you could come out like me thinking the enjoyment I got was ripping it apart on WhatsApp with my daughter afterwards, saying they could
Yes,
have done this,
yes.
they
Well,
could have
there you
done
go. You
that.
got some enjoyment out of
Yeah,
it,
yeah, yeah,
and very Austen-like as well.
yeah. I think Jane would have hated it, just to
Oh
say,
yes, absolutely.
absolutely hated it. Hope she would have gone marched up on stage and said, "Look, you don't understand me at all,
See,
any of you.
yes, yes,
No idea what
yes.
you're talking about."
How marvelous.
Anyway, so after that little diatribe, but I do feel that the ostentatious crew will feel that there's a balance here because you like it, I don't. So therefore,
Yes,
you know,
yes.
we end up
And
at two
I've
and
seen them several times, so
yeah.
I can attest that some
You're
evenings are better than
more
others.
rely on Kate rather than me. Okay then. So that's it for today. Thank you everybody and enjoy the coronation.
Huzzah! God save the king!